Hello again and welcome to this Mentats of Dune summary. Before I start, I just want to say thank you so much for your patience. This video is such a long time coming, but you know, life gets in the way. But I'm back and part 2 of this video is going to be up at some point during the week. And without further ado, onto the video. Gilbertus is still the headmaster of the Mentat school on Lamparas, and he founded this concept of the school 7 decades ago now. And it's been nearly 2 centuries since he received his life-extending treatment from Erasmus. As we all know, he still has to hide the fact that he isn't aging, so he colors his hair grey and he makes his skin look a bit rough. He's walking a very fine line though, being able to keep his school open amidst the Buterians' continued efforts to get rid of technology. Remember, his students were human versions of computers, and obviously they were preferable to the real ones, but the Buterians did keep a close eye on them because they didn't really like this idea of open exchange of ideas at the school. Gilbertus does have some protection though, because a lot of his mentats are indispensable to the Imperium. The Emperor's little sister, Princess Anna Corino, was also a student ward at the school, and she needed the rigorous discipline of the school, and her brothers wanted anything possible to be done to help her because there wasn't really a cure for her condition. Remember, Anna took the poison to undergo the transformation into a Bene Gesserit, but she ended up in a coma, and after that she was just never the same again. She really struggled to make sense of all the voices in her head, even though she did have some moments of lucidity. Joseph Venport still runs his very successful Venport Holdings, which at this point has a fleet of space folding ships with hundreds of navigators to pilot them. Right now they're heading to the planet Barage, about to bring medical supplies, melange and other necessities. There is a problem though. The ruling cabal of Barage acquiesced to Manfred Tarando's demand to rid themselves of all technology. It felt like they didn't really have much of a choice because the Buterians were very powerful and very destructive as well. Because of this, Joseph had terminated trade with them through an embargo. As the Venport fleet arrived, they saw old jihad ships guarding Barage, and they shot at the Venport ships, but they weren't really posing a threat. The leader of Barage did need the supplies, and he was desperate enough to pay a higher charge for them, but he did turn down Venport's deal to publicly denounce the Buterians. Speaking of the Buterians, Manfred, their leader, is currently leading an attack on a village who dared defy him. Manfred claims that Venport ships had been spotted there and that the village was trading with the enemy, with Venport enterprises. He gets the swordmasters to behead 3 of the village's mayors, and the Buterians go about damaging all of the homes. Vorian Atreides at this point has lived for more than 2 centuries. It's been more than 8 decades since the Battle of Corin. He was still working on the spice cruise on Arrakis. Valia still wants to avenge her late brother Griffin's death, and she wants to find Vorian, so she decides to take the poison in order to transform into a Bene Gesserit. She guesses that the resulting mental and physical powers will not only aid in her search for Vorian, but also in her continued plan to gain power. She takes her sister with her, and she intends to rejoin Rakella on the planet Wallach X, where Rakella has established a small sisterhood school. Tula Harkonnen, Valia's sister, is a beautiful 17-year-old who Valia believes can be trained and valuable to the sisterhood. Obviously, Valia had already indoctrinated her with Atreides' hatred. They arrive on Wallach X with something special adorning their coats. Taking pride in the new Harkonnen family crest that Valia had designed and sewed onto their coats before departure, a mythological creature with the head and wings of an eagle, the body of a lion, a griffin, in honor of their fallen brother. Rakella is meanwhile on Lamparas to collect the new Sister Mentat graduates. Headmaster Albans had finished training 10 sisters to serve as mentats. Those new Sister Mentats could memorize the numerous bound volumes of breeding records that Rakella had spirited away from Rossack into exile, and they could run their own complex projections of bloodlines. It was the most the sisterhood could do until they had their computers back. While the sisterhood school on Rossack had been disbanded, the Emperor didn't forbid them from starting a school anywhere else. Rakella is aging though, and she has many urgent tasks to complete before she dies. In the Imperium, Roderick is trying to get his brother, the wet blanket Emperor Salvador, to acknowledge that there's a lot of damage happening in commerce now that the Ven holding ships refuse to service others who have taken Manfred's Butlerian pledge. Melange will also not be shipped to Butlerian worlds. Salvador thinks that this situation is going to resolve itself when the Butlerians soon find out how difficult the life they have chosen is going to be, but Roderick thinks that his brother is too complacent. So the Butlerian worlds do get some spice from a rival shipping company, but they aren't as reliable or as safe as Venport Holdings. Reverend Mother Dorothea and a few other Reverend Mothers, they live in the palace as advisors to the Corino family. These Reverend Mothers were also used to study all visitors to the palace for emotional nuances. Dorothea has 100 sisters with her who are in training, and she'll eventually pick her protege who will take the Rosek drug to transform into a Reverend Mother. Joseph Venport also has a protected lab on the poisonous planet of Denali. Obviously, there are a lot of forbidden activities happening there. You see, the volunteers that go through the process to become navigators, the process doesn't always take, and their bodies sometimes fail, so their brains are kept in vats with electrofluid to give them nutrients. Somehow, these are still very useful in the fight against the Buterians, or they will be. Installed in their preservation tanks and connected to a network of thought roads, the proto-navigator brains easily adapted to the powerful walker forms he had given them. Ptolemy, the scientist, was particularly impressed by the agility and intensity of two former mercenary officers who had left their service to volunteer for navigator conversion, Hokevander and Adam Gall. Now they were among the most aggressive of the walker brains. Gilbertus is summoned by Manfred to the Butlerian city of Empok, the capital city of Lambalas. Manfred intends to prove once and for all that humans are superior to machines by having one of the Mentats play a game of chess against a robot. And this was a robot combat mech, and he'd ordered them all destroyed previously, but he left this one for this purpose. Gilbertus refuses to let any of his students take the test, so he says he'll do it himself. One day, as Anna Karina is about to go to bed, she hears a voice. It's a male voice though, so it's quite peculiar. "Hello, Anna Karina. I am your friend. I can help. I can strengthen your thoughts," the voice continued. It sounded friendly, powerful, confident. Anna desperately wanted a friend. "I can teach you to organize your mind. You can have clarity if you let me explore the avenues and byways of your mind. Let us discover them together." Anna likes the voice and she finds it quite soothing, and it turns out to be Erasmus. Erasmus had laid down electrical pathways throughout the school so that he could spy on the students. This is how he passed the time while being locked away, and he's always wanted access to Princess Anna, and now, in Gilbertus' absence, he has it. Raquella considered the Harkonnen genetics might offer intriguing possibilities, but she could not visualize Valia as a breeding mistress. She was too independent, too forceful. This beautiful new girl, Tula, on the other hand, might be perfect for the program. So Raquella also decides that it's time to bring the computers back from Rossack, because those have their complete breeding record, so Valia is dispatched to Rossack. Wolof X had once been a synchronized world, home to an enslaved human population. When the Sisterhood re-established their school there, they discovered a network of deep bunkers left behind before the fall of the thinking machines. Now those underground shelters were a perfect place to install and hide the retrieved computers and breeding records. As for Valia's main aim, she's not forgotten it. Valia had spent the past year making sure her sister knew exactly how Vorian Atreides had wronged House Harkonnen, and Tula was equally determined to punish the aloof, long-lived war hero. The young woman's determination pleased Valia very much. Valia was strong enough to balance the two driving goals in her life. She could not rest until she destroyed her brother's murderer, the man who had brought ruin upon her entire family. That was her personal obsession. But in the larger picture, Valia could change the course of human history, the evolution, if she were able to guide the Sisterhood. She had never been one to settle for small ambitions. Vor, meanwhile, remains haunted by Griffin's death, and he feels guilty for it and a lot of things that he feels he could have done differently in his life. He decides to return to Lanky Vale, where the Harkonnen family still lives. Among Drygo's other duties, Director Venport had delegated oversight of the spice harvesting operations to him. At this time, Drygo is on Arrakis to collect some of the Fremen to offer them work on the off-world. In fact, these are the Fremen who had been sabotaging the spice harvesting, so it's decided by Venport, at Drygo's suggestion, to put them to use them to sabotage their rivals. "Let me offer you an opportunity, a way to channel your abilities. You know the desert, and you know that the desert is not everything in the universe." He gestured towards the projection wall. "Wouldn't you like to go somewhere different? Perhaps to a planet with so much water that you could immerse yourself in it. Look up at the sky and see droplets falling through the air like sand whipped up by a storm?" So as mentioned, this is Venport's way of wanting to combat the sabotage of his operation and bringing those saboteurs onto his side to sabotage his competition. And obviously he does this, well, Drygo does, by enticing these young Fremen with an adventure on another world. Gilbertus reaches the Imperium and he starts his chess match with the Psymech. There's an audience, which he resents, and he also resents this idea of him being used as a tool by Manfred. Still, he played pyramid chess for the last century and a half against Erasmus, so he was skilled and determined to win. He goes on to win the match, and Manfred is gleeful and he's gloating. The Mentat headmaster proved what we already knew. Machines are not only evil, but are obsolete, irrelevant, and inferior to man. They serve no useful purpose. They can all be destroyed, and our civilization will be the better for it. We can improve ourselves without the taint of machines. After this, the mob in celebration goes on a rampage festival, burning and destroying 3 parts of the city, with Manfred standing by, not calling off his followers. He thinks it's harmless, that they need to let off steam, but the brothers, Emperor Salvador and Roderick, are appalled by this. Meanwhile on Arrakis, Taref is one of the desert dwellers who decides to take Ven Holdings up on their offer to leave Arrakis. He'd always felt trapped and isolated on Arrakis, and he dreamed of a different world. Now he got his chance to see more on a space-folding ship to Kolhar. Vorian Atreides, meanwhile, assumes a fake name, Jeron Egan, and he goes looking for work on one of the Harkonnens' whale fur boats. He calls himself a writer, and he says that he's not looking to take a salary from the work, he just wants to write about his experience. And secretly, obviously, he wants to help the Harkonnens because he has this vast wealth spread across many planetary banks, and he knows that they'd be too proud to accept any charity, so maybe an anonymous donation after he's gotten to know them a little bit better will work. Valia Harkonnen suggests that Tula go to Caladan to see the latest descendants of Vorian Atreides and his children with Veronica. Their sons' grandsons, William and Ori Atreides, still live on Caladan. In the Imperium, Roderick is reeling from the death of his daughter Nantha and her nanny, who were trampled during the violent Butlerian parade and killed by the Butlerians. Erasmus convinces Anna to take some Sappho, which is a mind-enhancing, deep ruby-red coloured drug that could make her thoughts more clear. She starts to get more memories, very bright and vivid, of her days at the palace, but after a while they grow more intense and she's unable to stop them. The memories also include some of the more traumatic things that happened in her life. Memories that she'd since buried. She hears Erasmus's voice, delighted that she took the Sappho, and he wants to know all of the details as if she's some kind of experiment. Norma Kenva, meanwhile, stresses the importance of more navigators once again. They need them for the Spacing Guild, she says. She and Yosef eventually travel to Silius Secundus to address the Landsraad. And this is when he announces that the company has just purchased more vessels and is expanding its fleet. When Emperor Salvador is outraged by this, Yosef reminds him that he has his own financial interests to look out for, and that the Buterians have already caused so much damage to his business, but also on Zamir, where their actions have resulted in the death of his niece. Until the Butlerian leader stops inciting his followers to violence, I have no choice but to deny my services to Butlerian-controlled worlds. It is my right. He makes an impassioned plea to the Emperor to call off the violence and the inflammatory rhetoric. Yosef later tells Drago that researcher Ptolemy on Denali has some of the new transport Cymex ready for testing, and that they will be tested on Arrakis. But before that, Drago wants to make a trip to the Mentat school because he believes that his old mentor Gilbertus secretly isn't so sympathetic to the Butlerians. He thinks that Gilbertus could be an ally, and he intends to recruit him to the technology side. This doesn't quite work though. Of course, Gilbertus sees Drago's point, but he has his own self-preservation to think about, and so he won't openly denounce Manfred and the Butlerians. Valia has been training Tula to become a very skilled sister. The young blonde had a certain allure about her, an innocence and feigned vulnerability that made her attractive to young men. Valia had been helping her develop that sexual magnetism, counseling her to use her assets wisely. Tula needed to maximize her charms in preparation for meeting the unsuspecting young Atreides on far-off Caladan. Later, Tula tells Mother Superior that she has some family business to attend to on Caladan. So this isn't a lie, but obviously Raquella notices that it's a lie of omission, that Tula's not mentioning something, and she doesn't say anything though. On Seleucia, Dorothea questions one of the Suk Grand Inquisitors. She wonders why so many of the people questioned by him die afterwards, or they're killed, even though this is never what the Emperor orders. Kemada, the doctor, under pressure, eventually admits that they sell body parts to Toluxa flesh merchants. Venport, Drago, and Ptolemy and some others meet out on the wastelands of Arrakis. So not only was Ptolemy responsible for creating Cymex, he was also kind of a new Cymex himself. He had been involved with the design of the new Cymex, modifying the mobility systems, neural linkages, and the thought road controls, including sensors implanted in his own body. With this enhanced connectivity, the new Titans were much improved from the old enemies of humanity. These Cymex, with proto-navigator brains, could have torn General Agamemnon to shreds. Everyone in the Venport Circle is there to test these Cymex in the harsh conditions of the desert. 7 of the numerous new Cymex rose into ready positions on mechanical legs. These were the best and brightest, the ones selected for this demonstration. Standing high off the ground, all had high-powering engines, impenetrable armor film, and a suite of devastating weapons. Vor is still on Lunky Vale working with the Harkonnens on their whale fur business, which isn't going that well. Whale fur was a high-priced export from Lunky Vale, but an inefficient distribution system hindered House Harkonnen. Virgil's brother, Willa, along with Griffin Harkonnen, had attempted to change that and bring prosperity back to the family. Another disastrous failure. Now they needed to solidify their operations, add equipment and upgrade their processing facilities. If the Harkonnens could not earn enough to pay their debts, they would lose even their meager foothold on Lunky Vale. Already, the ambitious Bushnells were moving in, taking work, preparing to overwhelm the Harkonnens, and Vor could perhaps do something about that. Vor got along very well with the workers and the family. Now remember, he told them that he was a researcher, so he's working for no pay, and he's becoming a part of the family with his new hidden identity. There's also another Harkonnen son, Danvers, by the way. At some point, Vor sends a message via the ship to his bank to have the Harkonnens' debts paid in full, anonymously, and he intends to be gone by the time that the money is arranged. Valia gets permission from Wakela to travel to Ginas to observe and train with the Swordmasters so that she can bring some of those combat techniques back to teach the rest of the sisters. She also secretly thinks that these skills might come in handy if she ever has to fight Vorian Atreides. Out on Arrakis, Yosef is watching his 7 mechanical walkers guided by navigator brains. He's very impressed at how powerful and swift they are, and these are his very own titans. Suddenly, because of the vibrations, worms appear. And while the Cymex knew of the worms and what to do to defend themselves, they were no match for the worms, who destroyed 2 of them. The remaining 5 titans redoubled their attack, shooting flames, las beams, and exploding shells. Although several of the worms' armored segments looked ragged and damaged, the attack only enraged the beast. It lifted itself up and then crashed down on top of 2 Cymex, smashing them into the sand. The behemoth was so massive that even the walkers' enhanced armor could not protect them. In the end, only 3 Cymex remained, but the worm itself was also damaged. In fact, it was killed, but this was at the cost of killing 3 Cymex, so it was pretty high. Eventually, another worm rises up from the dunes and destroys the remaining Cymex. Yosef was pretty hopeful, though. This meant that he had data for the new test subjects, that they have a weapon with which to actually eventually fight Manfred and his legions. Tarif, one of the young men from Arrakis, and some of his friends arrived on the planet Junction Alpha. Remember, they're employed by Venport Holdings to sabotage the competition. This sabotage is serious business, and it often resulted in some deaths. Right now, though, Tarif was dispatched back to Arrakis to recruit more saboteurs for Venport. While Rakella and the other banished sisters rebuild their ranks on Wallach X, Dorothea and the others try to build a new order on Salusa Secundus. She goes to the Emperor with the latest analysis that she finds very troubling, Dorothea. Dorothea sketched out her discovery. Venport Holdings is more than just a shipping fleet, and the Director Venport's plans extend through all portions of our lives. He has created a vast invisible network, like a cancer working through the Imperium. He owns the largest spacing fleet, the only one with access to navigators for safe transport. He secretly runs combined mercantiles and controls commodities, transportation, the spice industry. He is the power behind the largest interplanetary banks, and he transports the majority of Imperial armed forces on their maneuvers. In short, he is everywhere, sire. We cannot even gauge the extent of the net he has woven around us. The Emperor said he expected as much when Venport acquired another shipping company, giving him monopoly of spacefold transportation. Dorothea is rather hysterical, thinking that this will eventually lead to their enslavement by machines again, but Roderick silences her by saying that even though Venport is dangerous, it's not his movement that's enticing violent riots, and that Manfred's predictions are exaggerated. So Rakella has a daughter named Sister Arlette, and she's just making her way back to Wallach X after doing some missionary work on other planets. Arlette is unaware, but she's Dorothea's mother. Dorothea obviously knows this because she went through the agony, and so she has other memories and she heard the internal voices. Arlette had never undergone the agony to become a Reverend Mother, but Rokella thinks that she's still very useful. Arlette was initially sent away because she refused to be of service to the sisterhood over her baby, which was unbeknownst to her, Dorothea, at the time. Arlette was still quite talented though, and she was the one who recruited Valia from Lunky Vale. One of Rokella's ideas is to bring in the group of sisters from Salusa Secundus into the fold. So she dispatches Arlette to Salusa to discreetly reach out to Dorothea. She wants both factions, the Salusa sisters and the Wallach X ones, to resolve their differences. And she says to Arlette to ask Dorothea to come to Wallach X to talk to Rokella before it's too late, because Rokella is not long for this world. The Gina school had been established during Serena Butler's jihad. For more than a century, skilled swordmasters had wrought great destruction on combat mechs and fighting robots. Now, long after the defeat of the thinking machines, Gina still produced the best swordmasters in the Imperium. Some worked as mercenaries for noble houses. Many espoused belief in the Buterian movement, since a true swordmaster needed no advanced technology, only a sword and the ability to use it. Vorian Atreides returns to Caladan after he leaves Lunky Vale, and even though his sons are long dead, he's still quite sad because he never got a chance to get to know his grand and great-grandsons on Caladan. Remember, Vor was never close to his sons because he spent a lot of the time away fighting on jihad business, and his sons often resented him for that. He'd met Loronica on Caladan over a century ago now. Now, with a wistful sigh, he continued into town, pausing for a moment to look at a statue on the outskirts, depicting him as supreme commander of the army of the jihad in a heroic pose, gazing into the distance. Vorian buys a round of beers for some local fishermen, and he asks them about any Atreides in town, and they tell him about another fisherman named Shanda Atreides. They tell him that the Atreides family has money in the fishing business after a distant relative, Vorian Atreides, sent them funds to start up their businesses. Shanda, he's told, is a good man who took in 2 boys, Willem and Ori, after their parents were killed in a hurricane. Vorian then heads back up to his room in the inn, determined to get to know his family and his descendants. Just then, there's a knock at the door, and it's Shanda Atreides. After hours of talking over beer, Vor eventually figures out their connection. Vorian attempted to trace the generations following Shanda's parents and grandparents back to Vor's own son, Kargan, and he learned that Willem and Ori were from the line that descended from his other son, Estes. Much to the joy of the people on Barage, Venport had ended its embargo and brought much-needed cargo to the planet. However, there is trouble. Anari, Idaho, and a group of volunteer Buterians had come earlier in the day, and they lay in wait, presumably to sabotage this truce. There were still some Barage residents who were dedicated Buterians, and so they contacted Manfred. And so while the leaders caved, some of the residents were still Buterian, and it's mentioned that while the people needed medical salves and cancer treatment due to the upswing in the solar cycle, they needed faith more. Some of them had lesions on their skins and cancerous growths resulting from the embargo, which had Venport temporarily withhold crucial medical supplies. But obviously the Buterians wore their injuries like badges of honor. Anari wanted to destroy Venport by setting a trap for their incoming ships, because this is the first planet to renounce the Buterians and they need to be punished. As the ships arrive, the leader announces to the people that he's done this in order to ease the suffering of his people. He reaffirms his commitment to never using thinking machines again, but these are much needed medical supplies. Just then, Anari gets a vision of Rhaena Butler telling her not to let this leader destroy what they've worked for. She and the other Buterians raised their crimson flags and they got to work destroying crates of cargo. They chopped off the leader's legs and dragged him bloody through the streets until he died. The rest of the government council was also killed. They make it on board one of the Venport cargo ships, continuing their destruction, and then they see a navigator. She found a plas chamber filled with orange-brown gas and a creature inside with an enlarged head, amphibious eyes, and webbed fingers. Its arms and legs hinted that it might once have been human. It had to be one of Venhold's mysterious navigators, the prescient things that guided the ships. "You must stop," said a voice through the speakers. "You have caused enough damage. You don't understand." She opened the hatch and the melange gas began to boil out, and the navigator obviously started to suffocate without it. Meanwhile, Taref is back on Arrakis on orders from Venport, and he thinks that his adventures haven't been quite what he's expected. He was basically doing what he always did, sabotage spice holding equipment, and it's just that now that people were getting killed over it. He walked for 4 days out in the desert until he reached his familiar Sietch. he approached the guards, telling them that he had an opportunity. Tareth's father and brother weren't at all impressed with his stories and his adventures, telling him that he left them to do all the work. Out in the desert, they don't care about off-world politics or far-off planets. Gilbertus was deeply disturbed by this latest uprising on Barage, even though he couldn't show it. He remembered how Drago had urged him to stand up to the Buterians, but this wasn't an option for him. He'd probably end up losing his school. Still, the excited reports that Manfred sent and his happiness over the success of the uprising didn't sit well with him. He knew his silence was cowardly. Erasmus eventually tells Anna of the location of his memory core, much to the shock of Gilbertus, who thinks that this is dangerous. What if she lets slip something to one of the students? Erasmus is insistent that they flee Lamparas though, and that he can cure Anna. If he does, then the Corinas would be beholden to them and help them. Gilbertus isn't sold, and he knows that the Emperor doesn't even have as much power as people think that he does. Anari shows Manfred an image of the humanoid navigator, and he thinks it's something vile that Joseph Venport created. Manfred also decides to go to Arrakis to convince the spice harvesters to not supply spice to Venport. Anari is having none of it though. It's not safe for Manfred to go there, so he reluctantly agrees to having his body double accompany her, and he'll stay behind because his safety can't be risked. When news of Barage reached Kolhar, Joseph couldn't find an appropriate outlet for his disgust and rage. The murder of more than 100 Venhold employees and 40 cancer doctors, the destruction of cargo shuttles, as well as a massive space folder, and the slaughter of a priceless navigator, Royce Fayed. Joseph Venport was livid. Not only had Manfred gotten his planets to reaffirm their commitment to the Buterians, but he'd also had the Emperor act against Venport in the form of tariffs and restrictions on Venhold trade. One of the first planets to pledge their allegiance to the Buterians was a small backwater planet called Lecter. They're small and not significant in terms of trade, but Venport decides to use them to retaliate and send a message. So he has his new Cymex that are guided by the brains of the failed navigators. He thinks that it would be easy for them to cause damage on Lecter without leaving a trace. Meanwhile, on the isolated planet of Denali, Ptolemy has continued to build his Cymic army and they're ready for action. He thinks that this will be a repeated time of the Titans, only this time they'll have a just cause. Norma eventually pilots a space-folding ship to Lecter. First, the walkers descended upon Lecter's primary farming market city where the natives didn't know how to react, except with terror. These towering Cymac walkers were the embodiment of their worst nightmares. Ptolemy did not bother with any recorded warning or explanation. There would be no survivors here, and he would be careful to leave no evidence behind that might identify the attacker. The new Titans charged through the town, and weapons fired from their bodies and arms exploded buildings and mowed down fleeing villagers. Carefully coordinated with the help of their superior navigator brains, the 18 Titans annihilated everything in the town, then spread to the outskirts where they laid waste to the surrounding farms. Tarek meanwhile left his old sietch and made his way back to Arrakis city. At one point he wondered whether he should go back at all. If he suddenly disappeared, Venport would just assume that he'd succumbed to the dangerous desert. Perhaps he'll stay behind and work on one of the spice crews since he'd failed on his mission to recruit volunteers. Just then, Inari Idaho and Manfred Tarondo on her shoulders were walking through the streets, and Tarek knew that this was Venport's enemy, that he wished to cut the head off this particular snake, and he had his Mahula pistol with him and he knew what to do. Tarek drew his Mahula pistol, aimed and fired. The projectile struck Manfred in the head, shattered his skull, and splattered brains and blood all over the shot supporters. Remember that Inari had insisted that his body double go with her? Anyway, Taref reports to Venport that he killed Manfred. Obviously he thinks that this is Manfred, and Venport tells him that he did good work. Anyway, this is the end of part 1. Stay tuned for part 2.